When James and Martha decided to rent out the extra room in their modest bungalow in Joss, they didn't think twice about advertising. Within a week, a man named Michael showed up at their door. He was tall, with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to look right through you. He spoke softly, explaining that he was new in town and needed a quiet place to stay. "I'm a writer," he said, smiling faintly. "I'll mostly keep to myself." James liked the sound of that. Martha, however, felt an unease she couldn't explain. Michael paid the rent up front for 6 months and moved in the very next day. At first, everything seemed normal. Michael was polite and kept his distance. But James began to notice something strange. No matter the hour, early morning, mid-afternoon, or deep into the night, Michael's light was always on. The soft hum of a typewriter echoed from his room without pause. "Doesn't he ever sleep?" Martha asked one evening, her voice low. James shrugged. Maybe writers have odd hours. But it wasn't just the typing. The couple realized they had never seen Michael eat or drink. He didn't join them for meals, and the fridge stayed untouched. Even stranger, he barely left the house. James tried to dismiss his growing curiosity, but Martha's anxiety was infectious. One night, James decided to knock on Michael's door to invite him to dinner. There was no answer, but the typing stopped instantly. When James tried the door handle, it was locked. He walked away, but the sound of typing resumed as soon as he left. "Something's not right about him," Martha said, her voice trembling. "We should ask him to leave." James nodded, but deep down, he wanted to know the truth. Who was this man who never seemed to sleep? 2 weeks after Michael moved in, their neighbor, Mrs. Benson, paid an unexpected visit. She was an older woman, known for her gossip and sharp tongue, but this time, her expression was serious. "James, Martha," she began, sitting stiffly in their living room. "That tenant of yours, where did he come from?" James frowned. "Why do you ask?" Mrs. Benson leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "I've seen him, late at night, just standing outside. He doesn't move, doesn't say a word, just stands there, staring at nothing. It's not natural." Martha's face paled. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I'm sitting here," Mrs. Benson replied. "Last night, I woke up around 2 a.m. When I looked out my window, he was in your garden, just standing there in the dark." James tried to laugh it off. Maybe he was just getting some air. But Mrs. Benson shook her head. "I've lived here for 30 years, James. I know when something isn't right. Mark my words. That man isn't who he says he is." After she left, Martha couldn't shake the fear Mrs. Benson had planted. That night, she stayed awake, listening for the faint sound of footsteps or the creak of the garden gate. At 2:15 a.m., she peeked out the window. Her breath caught in her throat. Michael was there, standing in the middle of the garden, motionless. She grabbed James, shaking him awake. By the time he looked, Michael was gone. "You imagined it," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. Martha wasn't convinced. The mystery surrounding Michael was growing, and she felt they were running out of time to uncover the truth. One rainy evening, James and Martha heard a knock on the door. Standing outside was a young man, soaked to the bone. "I'm looking for Michael," he said, his voice urgent. "Is he here?" James hesitated. "Yes, but who are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he pushed past James, heading straight for Michael's room. He pounded on the door. "Open up, Michael. You can't hide forever." James and Martha exchanged worried glances. "What's going on?" Martha asked. "He owes me answers," the man snapped. The door creaked open, and Michael stood there, calm as ever. "You shouldn't have come here, Daniel." Daniel stepped back, fear flashing across his face. You promised it was over. Why are you still doing this?" Michael's voice was low, almost soothing. "Leave now, Daniel, before it's too late." Without another word, Daniel fled, disappearing into the rain. James turned to Michael, but before he could ask anything, Michael closed the door. The lock clicked, and the typing resumed. "Who was that?" Martha whispered. "I don't know," James replied, but his curiosity was burning. What kind of secrets was Michael hiding? James couldn't stop thinking about the encounter with Daniel. Something about Michael's calm demeanor and Daniel's panic didn't sit right. Against his better judgment, James decided to investigate. One afternoon, while Michael was out, a rare occurrence, James found himself standing in front of Michael's door. It was locked, as always. He glanced around to make sure Martha wasn't watching, and then retrieved a spare key he had kept for emergencies. As the door creaked open, James's heart raced. The room was immaculate, almost unnaturally so. The bed was perfectly made, and the desk was spotless except for the typewriter sitting at its center. But what caught James's attention were the papers stacked neatly beside it. Each sheet was filled with strange symbols, none of which James could understand. On the far wall, there was a large corkboard covered in photographs and newspaper clippings. James stepped closer and froze. The photos were of people he didn't recognize, all marked with red XS. But in the corner of the board, there was a photo of him and Martha, taken without their knowledge. A cold chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, he heard the front door open. Michael was back. James hurriedly locked the door and returned to the living room, trying to appear casual. When Michael entered, he looked directly at James, his piercing gaze making James feel like he had been caught. "Is everything all right?" Michael asked, his tone calm but with an edge that made James's stomach churn. "Why yeah," James stammered. "Just relaxing." Michael nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on James for a moment longer before he disappeared into his room. The lock clicked, and the typing resumed. James knew one thing for sure: they were in danger. Martha had noticed the change in James. He was quieter, more distant, and constantly glancing at Michael's door. When she pressed him for answers, he simply said, "We need to be careful," without elaborating. That night, a fierce wind howled through Joss. The power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Martha lit a lantern while James checked the fuse box. As she sat alone in the living room, the faint sound of whispers drifted from Michael's room. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the whispers grew louder, forming distinct words. "Leave while you still can." Martha's blood ran cold. She crept closer to Michael's door, pressing her ear against it. The whispers seemed to come from multiple voices, overlapping and echoing in eerie harmony. Suddenly, the door creaked open slightly, as if inviting her inside. "Martha!" James called from the hallway, his voice startling her. She turned to see him holding a flashlight, his expression tense. "There are voices," she whispered, pointing to the door. James stepped forward, pushing the door open with trembling hands. The room was empty, save for the typewriter, which sat eerily silent on the desk. The lantern's flickering light cast strange shadows on the walls, which seemed to shift and writhe. And then they saw it, a figure standing in the corner, its back turned to them. It was tall, with broad shoulders and an unnatural stillness. "Michael!" James called, his voice cracking. The figure slowly turned, revealing a face that was not Michael's. Its hollow eyes and twisted smile sent both James and Martha stumbling back. In a flash, the figure vanished, leaving the room deathly silent. "We have to leave," Martha whispered, clutching James's arm. "Now." But before they could move, Michael appeared in the doorway, his expression calm but his eyes burning with intensity. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice cold and sharp. James and Martha froze, caught between the man they feared and the shadows that seemed to haunt his room. Michael's piercing gaze pinned James and Martha in place. He stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind him, the sound reverberating through the tense silence. "What were you doing in my room?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with an edge that made James's chest tighten. James tried to maintain his composure. "We heard noises," he stammered. "We thought you might be in trouble." Michael chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "I don't need saving, James. But you might." "What do you mean?" Martha asked, her voice shaking. Michael tilted his head, studying them as though weighing whether they were worth his time. "You shouldn't have entered this room. Some doors are meant to stay locked." Martha, despite her fear, couldn't contain her frustration. "Who are you, Michael? Why are there pictures of us on your wall? What is all this?" Michael sighed, as if their questions were a nuisance. He walked over to the typewriter and gently ran his fingers over its keys. "You wouldn't understand even if I told you," he said. "But I'll say this, curiosity has cost people far more than they were willing to pay." James stepped forward, anger boiling beneath his fear. "Enough of this cryptic nonsense. If you don't give us answers, you're leaving this house tonight." Michael's expression darkened, and for the first time, his calm demeanor slipped. "You think you can throw me out? Do you have any idea what I've protected you from? What watches this house every night?" James faltered, but Martha pressed on. "Protected us from what?" Michael stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "There are things in this world you don't see, things you're lucky not to see. They're drawn to people like you, curious, reckless, unguarded. I keep them at bay, but you're meddling," he trailed off, shaking his head. "You've disrupted the balance." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The shadows on the walls began to shift and stretch, forming grotesque shapes. Martha clutched James's arm, her breath coming in short gasps. "What are you?" James asked, his voice barely audible. Michael's eyes glinted. "I'm the reason you're still alive. But that can change." As if on cue, the lantern flickered violently and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing, surrounding them like a swarm. James fumbled for his flashlight, its beam slicing through the blackness, but Michael was gone. The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the suffocating room. "James!" Martha cried, panic rising in her voice. The whispers intensified, and the shadows grew closer, their forms more distinct, long, clawed hands reaching for them. James banged on the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. A voice, Michael's voice, echoed through the room, though he was nowhere to be seen. "You wanted answers, didn't you? Let's see if you're ready for them." The room spun, and James and Martha felt themselves pulled into a vortex of darkness, the world around them dissolving. When the chaos subsided, they found themselves standing in a vast, desolate landscape, the sky a swirling mass of red and black. They weren't in their home anymore, and Michael was nowhere in sight. "Where are we?" Martha whispered, tears streaming down her face. James shook his head, his voice trembling. "I don't know, but I think we've made a terrible mistake." James and Martha stood frozen in the eerie landscape, their hearts pounding in their chests. The air was heavy, filled with a low, unsettling hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The ground beneath their feet was cold and ashen, stretching endlessly into the crimson horizon. "What is this place?" Martha whispered, clutching James's arm like a lifeline. Before he could answer, a figure appeared in the distance, walking toward them with measured steps. It was Michael. But this time, he wasn't the calm, soft-spoken man they thought they knew. His presence was commanding, almost otherworldly. His eyes glowed faintly, and shadows seemed to ripple around him like a living aura. "You shouldn't have meddled," Michael said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the strange world. "You forced my hand." James stepped forward, summoning what little courage he had left. "What is this place? What are you?" Michael smirked. "This place. It's a thin veil, a borderland between your world and others. You wouldn't understand, but you've been brought here to see the consequences of your actions." He gestured to the sky, and the red and black swirls parted, revealing glimpses of horrifying entities. Giant, formless shapes with glowing eyes moved through the void, their monstrous forms defying logic. Their mere sight sent chills down James and Martha's spines. "These are the things I keep at bay," Michael continued. "They hunger for chaos, for fear. Your curiosity has drawn their attention, and now they're watching." Martha shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Why us? We didn't mean any harm." Michael sighed, almost pitying them. "It doesn't matter what you meant. The moment you opened my door, you invited their gaze. I've spent decades maintaining the balance, staying unnoticed. But you've disrupted everything." James clenched his fists. "So what now? You just leave us here to die." Michael's expression hardened. "I didn't bring you here to die. I brought you here to make you understand. Your survival depends on your ability to listen and obey." Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The entities in the void grew restless, their eyes fixating on James and Martha. Michael raised a hand, and the trembling stopped. The creatures seemed to retreat slightly, as if wary of him. "You're lucky," Michael said. "I can still fix this, but it comes at a cost." "What cost?" James asked, his voice cracking. Michael stepped closer, his glowing eyes piercing through the gloom. "Your silence. You must forget everything you've seen, everything you've learned about me. If you can't, these creatures will never stop hunting you. They will find you, no matter where you hide." Martha sobbed, clinging to James. "We'll forget. We promise." Michael nodded. "Good. Then close your eyes." The world around them began to dissolve, the crimson sky fading into darkness. The last thing they saw was Michael's faint, glowing gaze, watching them as if he could see straight into their souls. James and Martha awoke on the couch in their living room, gasping for air. The room was still and quiet, the only sound coming from the faint chirping of crickets outside. It was as if nothing had happened. But when they looked at Michael's room, the door was wide open, and the space inside was completely empty. No typewriter, no photos, no papers, nothing. It was as if Michael had never existed. Martha turned to James, her voice trembling. "Was it all a dream?" James shook his head. "I don't think so. They never saw Michael again. But every so often, late at night, They would hear faint whispers outside their window or catch a glimpse of shifting shadows in their garden. They kept their promise and never spoke of Michael to anyone. But deep down, they knew he was still watching, keeping the balance between worlds, and ensuring they never forgot the price of their curiosity. Thank you for watching. Kindly like, comment, subscribe, and share for more.